All right, let's get into it. Sorry about that fan at the start. Anyway, so last time we went over lawyers, judges, and statutory interpretation. Uh, Now we're going to be moving into more specific types of law. We're going to be looking at tort law, and next video we're going to be looking at criminal law. I know, very exciting, very exciting. Okay. So the objectives. We're looking at introduce tort law, so define it and its purposes. We're looking at distinguishing tort law from criminal law, right? Clarify how private wrongs differ from public wrongs. Private wrongs are tort, as we'll see, and public wrongs are criminal, as we will see, and explore different types of torts. That's going to be fun. Discuss various categories, notably intentional torts, and of course, negligence, which plays a huge part in things, especially like strict liability, which we will get into. Okay. So, you might be asking yourself, well, I mean, we're talking about it, but what exactly is a tort? Well, luckily for you, I'm here to answer that question. Okay, so a tort is essentially a private wrong committed against anywhere from an individual to a government body, corporations as well. It's considered a civil matter as opposed to a criminal one, private compared to public. Tort law, unlike criminal law, where criminal law's purpose is to establish guilt and kind of dispense justice, the purpose of tort law is to provide a remedy, typically in the form of compensation to the injured party or the victim. It focuses more on liability and repercussions of that in comparison to intent and guilt, which is what criminal law focuses on. So, just looking at the objectives again, we already have one of our primary purposes established here. Again, one of the primary differences, again, when it comes to criminal law, it's about establishing intent, establishing guilt, dispensing justice. While tort law is about compensation, remedying, and more about liability, right? Yeah. So unlike contract law, tort law deals with breaches of duty that exist by virtue of law, not by agreement. So, again, just to nail that down, because contract law can be private, just like tort, contract law specifically deals with the breach of a breach of duty with regards to an agreement, not by law. Tort law deals with a breach of duty with regards to the virtue of law, not by an agreement. So just to reiterate that again, violating a contract or an agreement falls specifically within contract law, not directly within tort law. A couple of extra things. In tort law, there are plaintiffs, or the person filing for damages, and a defendant, as opposed to a prosecution and a defendant. And just a light thing to touch on, we will touch on it in criminal law, but the prosecution is considered to be the state. That's what it means when you hear that. So yeah, tort law, plaintiff versus defendant versus criminal law, prosecution versus defendant. Another thing, in Canada, we don't personally press criminal charges. The police can do it on behalf of us if we request it. But that's more about criminal law. The whole pressing charges thing. When it comes to tort law, we pursue that privately. It isn't a public thing, and we can pursue a private form of justice or compensation for any incurred damages, which is the purpose of tort law in itself. Moving on. Here we're just going to be, again, comparing more and more of criminal and tort law. That's very, very important. And we're just going to kind of lock in, get right into it. So, then let's get into the nature of the wrongdoing, the nature of the wrongful act in both criminal and tort law, right? So, in tort law, when it comes to the nature of the wrong, tort law is addressing private wrongs. The injury is personal. It's not a public thing. It's not an offense against society as a whole, but a person or a body of persons. And the remedy to that is compensation, right? So again, tort law, private wrongs, injured person, remedy is compensation. Criminal law deals with, again, offenses against society at large, as a whole. The wrong is seen as an offense against public interest. And that's where they differ with regards to the nature of the wrongs. Tort law, private, criminal, public. a person or a smaller body versus society as a whole. The remedy is compensation versus, dispense justice and guilt. And through that, again, the objective of criminal law is to punish and deter criminal behavior, express societal condemnation through general deterrence or specific deterrence, expressing personal condemnation. It's about protecting public interest and even at the end of that process rehabilitating the offender. Tort law is very different. It's not about punishing and it's not about deterrence. It's about restoring the injured party to the position that they were in before the wrongful act, usually through compensation. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's more tame. It just means that they fulfill different roles, completely opposite sides of the track. What are the standards of proof in both tort and criminal law? In tort, the standard of proof revolves around liability, versus in criminal law, it revolves around guilt. So, tort focuses again on liability. In court, you can be found sufficiently liable based on guilt being more probable than not. So in criminal law, it's focusing on intent, and guilt must be sufficiently proven, specifically beyond a reasonable doubt, while in tort law, it's more probably than not. So that's when we get into liability as opposed to explicit intent. Tort is generally based on a balance of probabilities or the preponderance of the evidence, while again tort law or criminal law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Mens rea plays a big role in criminal law. We'll get into that in the next chapter. But mens rea is essentially about defining the mental. It is the mental state required to commit a criminal act. And in criminal law, a key element is proving the defendant's intention to commit that criminal act. It's about proving mens rea. Tort law doesn't generally require proving intent, unless dealing specifically with intentional torts, and we'll get into that. Just one more thing when it comes to a difference between the two of them. Jury involvement is a big thing. In civil tort, sometimes you get the right to a juries, though they're not really that common, and it's only really specific circumstances where you're permitted to have them. But again, generally, you don't really have the right to a board of peers reviewing your case. But if you're suing someone for more than $75,000 in damages and such, you can have one. The difference between that and criminal is in criminal law, you are always entitled to a jury. You may not choose one, but you are always entitled to one, and that's a key distinction. A couple of other things. Case law informs both tort and criminal law. Again, we talked about case law. Actually, I haven't recorded a video for it, but I will. Case law is a very dynamic, kind of constantly changing form of law that builds upon statutory law, much more rigid. In criminal law, they'll take consideration of your criminal history. In tort law, they don't. Unless you consistently make vexatious claims or baseless and meaningless claims. If you're prone, and they see that you're prone to making meaningless, kind of ridiculous, baseless, unnecessary claims on a consistent basis, they might look into your history. So don't. Is probably the best advice that I can give for that. The similarity that they share, and this is important, is that depending on what the court determines, compensatory damages or compensatory charges may be ordered upon a person found guilty as a form of punishment. This is called punitive damages. So again, on top of what is being paid, they may pay more. Again, the damages and punitive damages are usually over and above what's required. Both tort and criminal law can see this employment of compensatory charges. Yeah, and specifically looking at criminal law, that's where it really shares more of a similarity to tort law than tort law does to criminal law, because again, this is an element of criminal law where you can see financial punishment coming into place, sort of like in tort law, right? Yeah. And finally, um, yeah. In the US, the state government is responsible for criminal law, but in Canada, the federal government is responsible for criminal law. And this kind of opens up a whole different conversation about kind of like provincial slash state jurisdiction. Um, for example, like in America, you can cross the border like between states, and technically you will be kind of cleared on a charge. Not cleared because you're still charged in a different state, but the point is that you are charged in a different state, and unless there's communication between states, you're good. In Canada, the federal government's responsible for criminal law. So, if you're charged with something, you're cooked everywhere. There's no crossing state lines to try to escape those charges, or provincial lines to try to escape those charges. Right. All right. Now we're going to get into specific types of torts, kind of defining torts. This is very, very important. So we have intentional torts. Again, like we looked at earlier, when it comes to intentional torts, um, that's when you have to prove intent. When again, like we talked about earlier, when it comes to standards of proof in the difference between criminal and tort law, we talked about mens rea when it comes to criminal law and proving intent, or the not proving intent, but the intent needed to commit a criminal act. Uh, Tort law doesn't really require you to prove intent unless you're dealing with intentional torts. If you're dealing with intentional torts, it must be that intent to cause physical, mental, or reputational harm against you. Your legal team would have to prove that. They would have to prove intent for the other side. Um, yeah. Just before we get into more of it, just to establish a basis for tort law, um, you have to be able to quantify and qualify damages. Um, if there's no qualification for the damages, there's nothing kind of substantial about the tort suit. It will be foregone. But yeah, just to revisit that, intentional torts, harm caused intentionally, you have to prove that. Um, Two, this is where tort really gets its own kind of special name here, because this is where we get into negligence. We're looking at unintentional torts or negligent torts. This results from a lack of reasonable care. So, negligent torts attempt to hold a person responsible or accountable for unintended consequences of their actions caused by negligence. Criminal negligence is defined in Section 219 of the Canadian Criminal Code. Everyone is criminally negligent who is doing anything or is omitting to do anything that is his duty to do. Um, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. I know it's a little bit confusing, but when it comes to duty and standard of care, uh, we'll get into that in a second. But again, criminal negligence, Section 219, part of unintentional torts, because those are negligent torts. Everyone is criminally negligent who, in doing anything or in omitting to do anything, shows want or reckless disregard for the lives of safety or other persons. So just one more time, before we get into the duty and standard of care, unintentional torts are negligent torts, unlike intentional torts, which are just intentional torts requiring you to prove intent. Unintentional torts are negligent torts that result from a lack of reasonable care, where you're holding someone accountable for the unintended consequences of their actions. Your ability to do that is defined in Section 219 of the Criminal Code, where it says everyone is negligent who, in doing anything or in omitting to do anything that is his duty to do, shows want or reckless disregard for the lives or safety of other persons. Yeah, I hope you got that after all of my rambling. Yeah, let's dive a little bit deeper into that. The key elements of negligent torts or unintentional torts are duty and standard of care. So your duty of care is a basic legal responsibility that rational, reasonable persons have. Um, like for example, in Calgary, it would be like shoveling your sidewalk. Um, we have laws saying that you have to shovel your sidewalk. So again, your basic legal responsibility is that you do shovel your sidewalk. And again, the legal responsibilities that a rational, reasonable person would have. Reasonableness is what a judge would decide a reasonable person to do in their context. And this has a key role to play in pretty much all kinds of law or legal cases. Standard of care is the big thing when it comes to negligent or unintentional torts. It's typically the thing that's being debated. This is the degree of obligation that someone owes to someone else in a duty of care. Again, this is where negligence comes in, which is, again, the failure to take proper care in doing something, resulting in consequences. So, for example, in Calgary, based on the law, my duty of care is to shovel my sidewalk when it's snowing. When it comes to standard of care, the standard of care for me shoveling my sidewalk is to do a good job and make sure that it is cleared and there is no snow left to freeze over. My standard of care is in question if I shovel my snow, but I only take off a top layer. Technically, I shoveled it as I'm required to by the law. I'm fulfilling my duty of care, but my standard of care is in question. In tort law, duty of care is established first and standard of care is established second. First, we see if you're upholding your duty, and then we examine if you're meeting the standard to do that. I think that that example about snowing in Calgary made a lot of sense to me when I heard it for the first time, and I hope whoever hears it experiences the same thing. Okay, so strict liability torts. This is a fun one. A strict liability tort attempts to hold a person or an entity responsible for consequences of their actions, even if there was no negligence or intent. So it's not an intentional tort. It's not an unintentional negligent tort. You're holding someone responsible for the consequence of their actions, even if they weren't negligent and there was no intent. And even if they did everything that they could do to prevent a thing from happening. This can get very complicated and very convoluted, and for that reason, levels of liability are considered, and they are important. And degrees of compensation, when you're bringing a case forward, rely on that level of liability in strict liability torts. So, again, if you did something accidental and the result was out of your control, you will still be held accountable, but there's levels to it. Getting into more liability, there is vicarious liability, which is a legal concept holding a party responsible for the actions of another party that they are responsible for. Again, it'll usually depend on the nature of the relationship between the two. This can move all the way up the chain of command, like parent and child, employer-employee, even person and dog, for example. Social host liability. It's the legal concept referring to a host of a party or of a gathering, or the owner of a bar or the bartender, for example, being held liable for injuries caused by someone who is intoxicated. So again, if you're hosting house parties, you better be careful, because you can get cooked if your guest does something fucked up. And product liability. Product liability is a huge thing in strict liability. If you cut your hand opening a bottle of Corona because the cap pops off and there's witnesses, you and the witnesses together, you can take that product's company to court, and you can usually get some out of it. Now, disregarding this notion of liability, pure accidents exist. A pure accident is literally implying that you had absolutely zero control, like none, like literally none. It's very difficult to prove, very hard to quantify, and again, implying that you had absolutely zero control in the resulting case being pursued against you, in which case you wouldn't be held responsible. But again, it's very high. It's very hard to prove that. Property torts. So we've moved on from unintentional, we've moved on from intentional, we've moved on from strict liability and the levels of liability and the different types of liability, and we're looking at property torts. So property torts, and these are going to come quick. Property torts concern wrongful interferences with a person's property rights. We have dignitary torts, which involve a violation of someone's dignity or rights, for example, like defamation. Um, Within dignitary torts, it has to be proven that there is wrongful information that someone is spreading knowingly that is violating their dignity or their rights. Yeah. Uh, Economic torts. This is addressing wrongful acts that cause economic harm. And toxic torts, which relate to harm caused by exposure to hazardous substances. This is usually in the context of environmental damages that have to do with the industry and the industry not meeting the standard of care with their environmental outcomes. And there can be overlap between many of these different kinds of torts. We'll expand on this more, but one other thing, in criminal law, again, the essential concept is intent, while in tort, the essential concepts are duty of care and standard of care that establish liability. Yeah. Let's get into more of these. Let's expand, especially on a few of the more important kinds of torts, specifically intentional torts. Let's take a swig of water first. Okay, so looking at intentional torts, an intentional act. To define the intentional tort, an intentional act is a tort committed with the intent of inflicting physical or mental harm. Yeah, there's a difference between there's a different standard between intentional tort and unintentional tort. Again, we kind of talked about that a little bit. The standard here is simply just proving intent. And we'll talk more about that through foreseeability and remoteness. But again, the standard with negligent or unintentional torts is more around levels of liability, that's a strict liability. The difference, the standard with intentional tort is about providing intent for harm caused, and with unintentional torts, it's about proving negligence, duty and standard of care, reasonableness, etc., etc. Within intentional torts, we look at these concepts of foreseeability and remoteness. So you look at an act, and intent has been proven; it's deliberate, but some consequences may not be, may not have been foreseen, if not reasonably foreseeable. So, for example, you beat someone up, and you didn't think that they would trip over a guy coming out of an alleyway or over a garbage can, and something else happens. That consequence was not foreseeable. So your act is deliberate. And by the way, beating someone up wouldn't be under tort law. I'm just using that as an example. But so again, the act is deliberate, but some consequences may have been unforeseen. Remoteness is talking about how closely related the cause and effects of a particular injury are. So again, we have foreseeability, where we're looking at the consequences of actions not being foreseeable, and we have remoteness, which is talking about how closely related the cause and effect of a particular injury are. So there's a lot of interplay between foreseeability and remoteness. If you get PTSD after getting punched once in your life, it's probably the case that PTSD was not foreseeable. But if I beat you up enough that you have to pay for plastic surgery and such, I could definitely still be held liable because the foreseeability and remoteness are substantive. That kind of damage is clearly foreseeable. The relation of you getting plastic surgery and that kind of damage that you would require plastic surgery for, there's a lot of remoteness there. Defenses in intentional tort law. Don't abuse these. Just saying. Defense is consent. That's a big defense. If the injured party agreed to the act, they are negating liability upon the person that would be held liable, but they're not negating it entirely, just somewhat. But explicit consent can be given, where literally whatever happens doesn't matter as long as the person has consented to anything. This has to be proven, though. And I'm pretty sure you could still be held criminally responsible for things like grievous bodily harm, even if explicit consent has been given, but I'm not sure. So yeah, we've consent, self-defense. If you committed an act to protect yourself or your property, that's a defense. But you have to prove that the threat upon that property or to you personally, there is a threat to you personally. So again, self-defense is an act carried to protect oneself. Self-defense of property also exists, but you have to prove that the threat upon that property is a threat to you personally as well. And there's a threshold when it comes to the definition of self-defense in Canada that's important. And we'll get into that more with criminal law, I think. Necessity. If you prove that the action you took was taken out of urgency, and that urgency was executed to prevent and avert greater harm, that's valid, right? The necessity to act, because if not, something worse could have happened. And legal authority. If your conduct was performed under the auspices of legal power, like policemen doing something, that's potentially a defense too. Yeah, let's expand again on negligence or unintentional torts. So, negligence, just for those who didn't catch it, it's a central concept in tort, and it covers many cases where harm results from carelessness rather than intentionality or intent. That was an unnecessary word. It's the failure of an individual or organization to meet a standard of reasonable care, resulting in a demonstrated injury upon a person. Right? Yeah. Just to kind of look at the elements of negligence again here, we have things like duty of care, or the legal obligation to adhere to a standard of reasonable care, and then we have standard of care, which is the degree or level of responsibility a person would apply in a specific context. Degrees of liability come in here. Again, just to redefine it, a reasonable person is defined as someone who would not be expected to be negligent under these specific circumstances. So if I stood in a crowded room with my fists out and spun, it's pretty reasonable that I'll hit someone. But if I do it in an empty room, it's pretty reasonable that I won't hit someone. We didn't talk about this, but breach of duty, just to define that, is a failure to meet your standard of care. Causation is part of negligence. It links the defendant's breach of obligation to the plaintiff's injury, or the breach of duty to the plaintiff's injury. This requires a pretty challenging line of accountability depending on the circumstances, but it's definitely provable. And remoteness, like we talked about before, it reflects whether a specific damage suffered by someone was reasonably foreseeable. So again, foreseeableness and remoteness still play a role in negligent torts. Yeah. Let's look at a couple cases here, a few cases actually. Just before we take a look at a handful of defenses, I just want to take a look at a couple of cases. So we have Moore versus, I don't know how to say the brand, Bayer, maybe? Moore versus Bohr, let's say that. It's Borzé Nike Hockey Incorporated Company. Moore versus Bohr is a civil case regarding the safety of hockey helmet manufacture after a kid suffered a serious injury playing hockey. The helmet was certified to the standards, though. So the plaintiff claimed that Bauer, that's how you said Bauer. The plaintiff claimed that Bauer was negligent in the design of the helmet, but again, the helmet was certified to the standards. They met their standard of care. The court determined that Bauer met the duty and standard of care. They met their due diligence, so they weren't held accountable. Buchan versus Orthopharmaceutical. Yep, in this case, this has to do with duty of care and warning consumers of danger. This is a case where a woman from Ontario suffered a stroke due to her oral contraceptive medication. She was awarded damages by the judges. She won her tort case, and it established in Canadian common law that there is a duty to warn consumers of dangers in products. Of or in. So again, it has to do with duty of care and warning consumers of dangers. Mustafa versus Culligan of Canada. This is to do with, again, remoteness and causation. Not again. This is the first time I'm telling you about it. This is to do with remoteness and causation and issues around it. So Mustafa sued Culligan for psychiatric harm suffered by seeing a dead fly in an unopened bottle of water. He claimed to develop depression and anxiety, and he sued for damages. The trial judge awarded the plaintiff money in damages, but it was decided that Culligan breached its duty and standard of care, and they were found strictly liable. However, it was found that the reaction to the breach was not foreseeable. Therefore, the Court of Appeal overturned the judgment on the basis that it was not foreseeable. Yeah. Defenses within negligence, looking at a couple of those, just like we did with intentional torts. So first, we have contributory negligence. So this is saying that the injured party's own negligence contributed to their own harm. This can reduce and even omit responsibility and liability for the person that is being sued, or the defense, right? Accident is a defense. The incident occurred without negligence on the part of the defendant. It was a 100% pure accident. Remember, we talked about that. A defense in unintentional tort, saying you had absolutely zero control of the situation. It has to be demonstrated that you had absolutely zero control, and it was a 100% pure accident. Again, very, very important that we specify. 100% pure, very, very hard to prove. Voluntary assumption of risk. The injured party knowingly accepted the risks being involved. We see this in things like waivers. Through this, liability can be incurred a little bit. It can still be incurred, but the liability can be reduced, which is, when money's on the line. That can be very, very important. Participation in the criminal act. Involvement in illegal activities can limit or bar compensation, essentially, or recovery, as I wrote here. Let's get into a key case when it comes to defensive negligence. King versus Redlick. It provides judicial commentary on these defenses, right? So King versus Redlick has to do with voluntary assumption of risk. The appellant, King, was struck by a hockey puck and suffered permanent damage. King wasn't wearing any kind of helmet, and so the courts dismissed the case as they knew the risks of playing without equipment. There was no legal standing, and they engaged in voluntary assumption of risk. So again, King versus Redlick, voluntary assumption of risk. Yeah. Punitive damages. Let's get into that. Punitive damages. We talked about that a little bit. It's part of punitive measures in punishment. Punitive measures is a term used to describe methods of holding people accountable, whether it's fines, imprisonment, community service, whatever it may be. And punitive damages, as we are talking about, is definitely part of that. The idea of punitive damages is a little bit controversial. The reason for that is because critics argue that punitive damages can duplicate the sanctioning function of criminal law. Personally, I don't think it matters that much. Punitive damages are awarded in addition to compensatory damages. They're meant to punish the defendant and deter similar conduct in the future. Their damages awarded in tort law beyond what is necessary to compensate the injured, just like compensatory damages. Yeah. Let's get into a couple cases for it, right? One case, actually. This is Witten versus Pilot Insurance Co. 1994. So, what is this case talking about? This is regarding punitive damages, naturally. The Wittens, who were the appellants, or the people presenting the case, um, also their house caught on fire. It destroyed valuable items and it killed 3 of their cats, which is very sad. The father was hospitalized and he was wheelchair bound, and because their house was burned, they had to spend money renting. The insurance incurred a significant amount of money, but they only paid $5,000 on a $300,000 plan. They hired their own fire investigator in an attempt to claim arson, saying it was a bogus insurance claim and intentional, but the investigator found no evidence. Still, despite their own investigator finding no evidence, they still pursued the case. The court, in the end, awarded the Wittens more than $1 million, with $1 million additional in punitive damages, claiming that the arson case was made in bad faith, and appeals were made, but all courts sided with the appellants. I know. Beautiful. Yeah. Just had to make a light edit. Yeah. Tort and accident compensation. Yeah, again, torts are compensation focused. Tort law, its primary goal is with providing compensation to individuals who were injured. But the efficiency of the process of the tort system is criticized. So some people argue that the traditional tort system is inefficient in addressing compensation for injuries. Some people say that victims receive a lot while some receive none, and the timeliness of the system isn't really great. When it comes to things like vehicles and work, tort law has been lacking, so we decided on alternative systems. These alternative systems come in the form of things like insurance coverage and compensatory boards. Insurance coverages, for example, like vehicle accidents, are typically handled through auto insurance now, and compensation boards, like work-related injuries, are often managed by workers' compensation schemes. If you ask me, actually, I definitely agree with this choice. I think it's good that the potential timeliness issue in the tort system forced alternative measures to be made, where now there are other bodies responsible for specific cases, while tort law as a system generally can focus on a lot more individualistic cases and kind of change their scope a little bit. Just a couple more things. Tort law in Quebec is codified in the Civil Code. In the rest of Canada, it's based on case law. Tort law cases Tort law and civil cases in America are much more common. Compensation is also much higher in the scale. The reasons are America tends to be more litigious, a lot more court, a lot more sensation. In the U.S., under their employment at will principle, companies can fire employees at random without explanation, and this can result in a lot of money being given back to the person fired. And their healthcare system. Their healthcare system being shitty results in a much higher compensation a lot of the time. So there we go. That is our 40-minute lecture on tort law. Yeah.